Evening, everybody. Just been trolling Jonathan Gullis. So, yes, the theme tonight is Rishi Sunak still in power. I've just had to check the news. He is still the Prime Minister, at least in name. I've just surrounded myself with some of the headlines that he will probably find uncomfortable at the moment. There's all sorts going on. And, you know, it's quite mad because it's all based around a fixation on, at the end of the day, a policy which, even if it were lawful, can't possibly work, isn't lawful, so certainly can't possibly work, is a complete madness. And they're pursuing, ultimately, it's just another dodge to spend money, to give away public money to their mates, really. That's all it is. 300 million, 290 million pounds. Well, 240 million pounds at the moment. Although interestingly, so we've had this news now that, so we knew about the 140 million pounds. That's gone. I saw someone asking on Twitter as well, saying, you know, can Labour get that money back? And it's like, well, not really, no. It's spent once it's given. If it's just committed, I don't know, not necessarily. But if the Rwandan government have got it, they've got it. Then, I mean, we can ask them nicely for it back. They'll say no. So they've got, so we knew about the 140 million. Then we're told they've been given an additional 100 million. Then we're told that next year they'll be getting another 50 million, which again, you know, that will happen because the Conservatives, well, unless they actually implode tonight, they will still be around to do that. And each year, you know, for several more years, we're giving them more money. And for what? So that some people that are mates of Suella Braverman can make money. Ultimately. But there it is. In the middle of all this, notice, now I'm going to put this here. So I've done a little, you know, electoral calculus, MRP calculator. Don't get too excited by these results. The reason I put this is based on YouGov's latest results. And although I talk up YouGov because they and Ipsos have been the two pollsters that have produced the most accurate polls just ahead of general elections for the last two general elections, right? But I do keep saying I think that YouGov are inflating Reform vote. But that is also a good reason to look very carefully at YouGov's polls when you're trying to look at how Tories are going to react, because they look at it. The Conservative MPs are utterly convinced that Reform UK are this big threat to them. Now, they are a threat to them, and actually, it is fair to say they're a big threat to them. Where Tory MPs are going badly wrong with their strategy is right. And they've never been in this situation, so you can sort of understand it in a sense. They've got Reform UK hiving off a lot of votes from this sort of authoritarian wing of the party. We say the right, but quite a lot of the votes they're hiving off are not right-wing people. They're left-wing people, but authoritarian people. And then you've got the moderate votes round the centre who are sort of central in terms of left and right, but also tend to be more socially liberal. And they're losing votes both ways. But where the Tories are going wrong is the evidence suggests that the people who are saying that they will vote Reform UK, very few of them can be won over by the Tories, because ultimately the Tories' major problem is Reform UK peddle the easy answers, just like Tories do. Only the Conservatives are in power. So people will look, oh, you know, they're both offering the easy answers, but the Conservatives are in power. They get to implement their easy answers. Turns out it's not that easy. But Reform UK are saying, actually, it is easy, and there's all these people in there who don't want to make it work. And so they're untested as far as these people are concerned. So it's really hard to, and that's empirical thinking, but a lot of polling suggests that people are very, very, you know, set on this idea of not voting Tory. You know, they'll vote Reform UK, or they might vote for some other nutter in their area. They might actually vote Labour. They might be more likely to vote Labour. They may not vote for anyone. But there we go. Have I considered doing a weekly recap, like a mega cut of all the videos I post weekly? I'm not sure that really works. I have sometimes thought about it. in all honesty, like a sort of recap of the major news. I'm not convinced the format worked. I have done something that wasn't quite the same one time. I used to do a video where I picked out some of the more engaged or interesting questions in the comments on the videos. But the problem is it's then on different topics. And I think the same thing is with a roundup. Do people really... Because we live in an age where people want news really immediately. And sometimes I feel if I'm talking about something that happened the previous day, if it's a story that was sort of under the radar and it happened a full week ago, that's still fine because it might be news to the people watching it. But if I do a video on something that was really big news, but the previous day, I sometimes think I'm probably doing this too late, aren't I? So I don't know that the idea of a catch-up one would work. And my tentative experience. Weekly recap with a dance music backing track. No. Apart from anything else, I would have to get music, which it can be licensed for free. But there we go. Susan's asking there, if Sunak faces a leadership challenge, should he call an immediate election? Do I think he might? I think it is really tricky. In a sense, yes, and there might be many Tory MPs who would prefer to go to the polls now than, or I mean, it wouldn't be now, it'd be in 2 months' time, than allow someone like Suella Braverman to maybe take over the party. The problem comes with this, you know, if you were to do the electoral calculus for the poll of polls, which averages out all the pollsters, which I don't think, by the way, is terribly accurate, but if you did that, the Conservatives look like they'd be winning 160 seats. And that poll of polls is quite flattering for them. So you can't... Because the argument would be for going for an election is that it would be very damaging. The leadership election would be very damaging because the Tory contenders would be attacking each other and their own party's record, because we know that they did it in summer of 2022. And although the 1922 committee will appeal to them not to do that, they will do that. They will absolutely do that. So the leadership contest itself will be damaging. And then if they get a proper nutter in charge, then, you know, the argument could be that the polling could get even worse. But when you're looking at a polling at the moment that gives you 81 seats, can it get worse? It can't really. Can't get worse than that. So it may well be that MPs don't want him to do that and that they would rather... Because that, I mean, that's the thing. I'd find it interesting, like, with Tory MPs, if they... What most Tory MPs would ideally like is for all the MPs to unite behind Sunak. That is the preferable stratagem because that is their best chance. Unite behind Sunak. Because let's be honest, the MPs who are going, I'm not united behind Sunak, but I'll unite behind Braverman. The rest of the party won't, or whoever it happens to be, Mordaunt, doesn't matter. There is no one, if Tory MPs will not, if they're not prepared to unite behind Sunak, who, let's be honest, doesn't really have any firm political views at all. If they won't unite behind him, they won't unite behind anyone. So if you accept that the party is going to remain divided all the way to the election and maybe beyond, what's best? An early general election, get it out of the way, and leave Labour with the mess? Because there's a lot of stuff coming next year. Is it better just to leave Labour with the, you know, carrying the can? Or do you have a change of leader? And I really don't know what they think because they both sound mad to me. I mean, I keep saying their best chance will be May. May the 2nd is their best landing zone, but it's not a good one. Could be a quite terrible one. But there we go. If the Tories really do drop to 81 seats in the next election, does that spell the end of the party? How do they recover? How long does that take? Does the money go somewhere else? So, interesting questions. I will constantly say the party will, while we have first past the post, the party will never die. It's the party of the very wealthy. There is no one else for them to back. Reform UK, people aren't going to vote for Reform UK. They're not established enough. even like in the future, they appeal to far too small a niche of people. So no, the Tories are the only game in town. Now, if you had proportional representation, that is different. There would be a lot of pressure on people within the Conservative Party to split back to their sort of natural, the parties with which they're comfortable. Labour may well do the same, probably would do the same. So, but in terms of the money attracting donations, that is a much more interesting question, because it would be very difficult to attract donations. You've got to think about who donates and why. There are some people who donate to the Conservative Party for the same reasons that people donate to the Labour Party, because they genuinely believe that is the best party for them, at least, or even the country. And given that a lot of them are very wealthy, yes, you will get incredibly wealthy people who will bung the Conservatives a few million quid here and there. Yes, that will still happen. But they also elicit a lot of donations from people who expect a financial return. And I don't mean a financial return in that they will run the economy in the way that favours them. I mean, actually, quid pro quos, whether it be government contracts or being able to lobby them for changes to legislation or reduce taxes that benefit them, that sort of thing. Those sort of donations are likely to dry up if they are beaten into a point where it looks like they cannot recover. But what I would point out is this. They're not really going to be beaten down to 8. Well, actually, you can't rule anything out. It's too mad. You can't rule anything out. They're really unlikely to get beaten down to 81 seats. 150, 160 is probably more realistic. But even that is really bad. Now, what you could say, if they were beaten down to, say, 150, you look at it and you think, well, they're going to be out of power for a very long time, aren't they? But you could also say, but people thought that of Labour after the 2019 general election. They were beaten down to fewer than 200 seats. They've still got fewer than 200 seats, and they've actually won by-elections. So they were beaten down to fewer than 200 seats. If the Brexit Party had stood all their candidates down that had been beaten down to much, they would have been on about 170. By my calculations, somewhere between 160 and 170 seats. So the Tories are looking for the sort of wipeout that Labour effectively got in 2019, and yet Labour completely reinvented themselves, and look where they are now. Now, part of that is down to the fact that the Conservatives completely imploded. But at the same time, if you're a Conservative, it can still give you hope that if they get the right leader in charge after the election. And in actual fact, if you look at a lot of the Tory MPs who are likely to lose their seats, it may end up being the balance of power within the Conservative Party is more towards the One Nation Tories and less towards the sort of the far right of the party. There may well be a lot fewer swivel-eyed loons comparatively. So we'll have to see what the dynamic of the party is like. But if you got someone credible, then they may imagine that they could turn it around very quickly. The element that will be missing is, will Labour implode? It is actually possible for Labour to implode like the Tories did. Because at the moment, you've got a lot of people in Labour, MPs in Labour, and again, they're going to basically double the number of MPs. We've got really no idea about the candidates who are just candidates. They're not even MPs yet. The new Labour MPs are going to outnumber the experienced ones. They're going to outnumber them badly. So what will the Labour Parliamentary Party be like? Don't know. At the moment, you've got a lot of Labour MPs who have got their heads down, their eyes on the prize. We need to win. What happens when they've won? Is Keir Starmer the sort of leader who can manage his party in power? He's proven to be the sort of leader that can manage them when he's given them a sniff of power, but they're still in opposition after a long time. Can he transition to being the sort of leader that maintains party discipline when they're in power and they all start saying, right, we were behaving ourselves so that you could win the election. You've won the election. Now we want you to start doing X, Y, and Z. So it is possible for Labour to implode. to go silly again, thinking that now that they're in power, they can just ignore all electoral strategy. But we will see. Despite the polling chaos, the Tories have raised a gross amount of money. Well, they were given 10 million quid in one go by someone who died. So that's helpful, yes. Again, it's, they attract the very wealthy. And there are very wealthy people who, without even having to die, will donate large sums to the Conservative Party because they think it's like, it's either the best party for them or they actually think it's the best party for the country. And, they've got the money. They are the ones with the money. Labour's backers not really generally that wealthy. Given the behaviour of the Tories recently, Stan will get the votes as he appears boring and safe in the middle of the road. Yeah, you have to be a little bit careful with that. We want people to actually turn out and vote. I don't think it's very much effort to walk out of your house towards you're basically walking down the road. Unless you've got mobility issues, it's really zero effort to go out and vote, unless you are literally working a 13-hour shift that day, in which case get yourself a postal vote. But people consider it a chore. And a lot of people, they don't want to vote for less shit. They want to vote for something that's actually going to be hopeful. Could I explain why people say Corbyn was unvotable? Still lost on that, would be honest with you, mate. Ultimately, Jeremy Corbyn was not a good politician. He's not very bright. It's really that simple. He really... People who support Jeremy Corbyn, you sort of ask them why, and 100% of the time, it's because he supports this, or because he supports that, or because he opposes this, so it's all about policies. And it's like, that's fine, but you don't get any policies implemented if you can't be elected, and you have to be very disciplined. Strategy is everything in an election, particularly for Labour. The Conservatives get away. The Conservatives are the default party of power for two reasons. First, traditionally, they don't have to fight for votes. The right wing will basically vote Tory, and they fight over the centre votes, right? Now, okay, Reform UK are throwing a bit of a spanner into that works, but that is generally the case with the Conservatives. And even with Reform UK, we will see it's still probably not as bad as the progressive vote being split. The second reason is that the Conservatives have the media backing them. There's plenty of client media, and the media that you can't describe as client media, they basically just, like the BBC, put people in positions of power to make it as if it might as well be. So those are the two reasons that make the Tories the default party of government. So if you have an election where both Labour and the Conservatives are getting their strategy very badly wrong, the Conservatives will win by default. So Labour have to be especially good on the message. They have to be bang on message. They have to be very clearly focused on who their target voters are. And the problem with Corbyn is he was, like many people with an extreme view of politics, he surrounded himself only with people. He would never get an advisor that didn't agree with him to the nth degree, because he wouldn't trust them. He didn't even really have a cabinet, a shadow cabinet. There was no real shadow cabinet. He had a small group of people he discussed things with. That was it. He didn't trust even most of the people in his own shadow cabinet. Completely unworkable. Can't work. He's not a clever man. He's someone with a very expensive education and ended up with crap A levels. He very bad at politics, incredibly bad at politics, really bad at the optics. Had no interest. They had the slogan "For the many, not the few." It was a brilliant slogan. Oh, it was the best slogan I've ever heard. But it wasn't true, was it? He didn't try to pitch to the many. He only focused on that narrow section of the population. And it's not enough. But anyway. Did I hear that Peter Hitchens, I didn't, but I'll read it out anyway, saying how Peter Hitchens, how radical he thinks Starmer was, is and will be in government. Seems to take everyone in the room by surprise. No fan of Peter Hitchens, by the way. Well, I'm not really a fan of anyone. By definition, if you're invited on to Question Time from the BBC, unless you're an MP and they sort of have to, I take a dim view of most people. But I think he wants to be. I think it's reasonable, though, to have questions. Because he's organised Labour very well in opposition, that's great. But as I always say, my requirement of a Labour leader is to win, in opposition, is to win the election. My requirement of the Labour leader, or indeed the Labour Party, in government, as there's a bigger list. And in fact, one thing I'm going to do is, when they win, one of the first videos I will do is how I'm going to measure their success. I'm going to lay my cards on the table and I'm going to say, I want to see exactly where we are at that point. And I'm going to say, right, these are the measurable outcomes I am going to judge Labour's success on. I'm not going to let them do a Rishi Sunak and they decide what their priorities are. It's like, you decide, I'll decide my priorities. And I will lay out with reasoning exactly which metrics, measurable metrics, I expect them to improve. But there we go. As a successful prosecutor, surely he would be pragmatist. I can't see him giving way to unachievable goals. No, but you do have to think big. If you want to reform, Keir Starmer clearly does want to reform. And in politics, lots of people use words incorrectly all the time. It does my head in. Except when I use it incorrectly, in which case it's just accidental. But the word reform is used a lot in politics just to mean changing something. That's not a reform. Reform, by definition, has to mean that the existing system is completely broken down and rebuilt. Otherwise, it's not a reform. So, for example, Labour's, like if we take NHS policies, so Labour's NHS policies are for a focus on, what do they call it, insourcing rather than outsourcing. So rather than giving contracts to private companies to deliver things that you could deliver internally, it's like reversing that. Now that would be a huge difference. That is the polar opposite of the way things have been going for a great many years. But is it a reform? No, it's just a change in emphasis on how you assign NHS money. And there are lots of things like that in Labour's policies that they're billing as reforms, but they're not reforms. But there are some things that genuinely would be reforms. So the one which we're not going to get in the first Parliament, but they'd better not leave it in the in-tray, is replacing the House of Lords with an elected chamber, regional, so it represents, so it's not just like stuffed full of people who either live in France or London, and their job will be to basically safeguard the Constitution, essentially, as well as still be a revising chamber. Now, that would be a reform because the House of Lords would be non-existent and you'd be replacing it with a completely different chamber that even has slightly different remit, but certainly has a different structure. That's a reform. You know, changing guidance, changing government guidance, that's not a reform. You say Jeremy Corbyn should have taken up the anti-Brexit position to win more votes. How do you win more votes? Like, Jeremy Corbyn literally became leader because he was the loudest voice attacking austerity during Miliband's years, right? So, in other words, Jeremy Corbyn was pretty much the only leader within the Labour Party who was attacking the Tories' #1 policy. So people went, well, that's the sort of thing we need. We need to challenge the Tories, not just go, oh yeah, we agree, just because people voted for them. So then we make Jeremy Corbyn leader, and what does he do? He basically backs the Tories' #1 policy again, except this time it's not austerity, it's Brexit. Now, what Labour needed to do was Well, actually, what Labour needs to do was much simpler than even just challenge Brexit. They just needed to not give Boris Johnson his general election. As soon as Theresa May pissed away her majority, Labour had her. I was going to say by the balls, but that's not, metaphorically. But they had her. And then she went, and then they had Johnson as well. He lost what? His first 6 or 7 votes in Parliament. He was nowhere. They had him in his box. Jeremy Corbyn had the power to dangle Boris Johnson on strings. And I know it wasn't Labour that actually voted for the bill that started their general election process off initially, but at the same time, they should have opposed it at the end because there were the numbers. But there we go. How will the SNP respond to a Labour government and Labour advance in Scotland? Probably in much the way they're doing now by trying to say, oh, they're just the same as the Tories. So we'll just have to see then what happens in government. From Labour's point of view, looking ahead to the Holyrood elections, well, I would still imagine the SNP will win the most seats, or more seats than Labour, should we say. It will be for Labour to provide, as far as they can, instant benefits. And people will say, and it's quite right to say this, the economy is so knackered. I mean, someone was just saying again, when Labour, or if they're saying if Labour win the election, which is very neutral, but when Labour win the election, they're going to inherit an economy, a society that's the most buggered it's been. They actually said since the 1970s, if you focus on the economy, okay, maybe you can make that argument. I would say, if you consider the social fabric of the country and the state of basically all the infrastructure, I would say that in modern times, no government has taken over under such a mess. The Labour are going to inherit a complete shit heap. In fact, Cold War Steve did quite a good cartoon on it a few months ago. They are going to inherit a complete shit heap. So it's not straightforward. But what I would say is that then provides the incentive for Labour to be more radical. Because if you can't grow the economy really quickly to the point where people will feel it in their pockets, what's your option? Your option is to improve their standard of living by a better redistribution of both rights and wealth. So the emphasis will be on Labour to do that. And I'll point out that people were saying that Rachel Reeves keeps dropping very big hints. I mean, they've already said it, it's not even a hint. Labour have a policy of basically obliterating all tax breaks that they don't see as necessary. So any tax break that they're looking at it and going, look, we don't get a return for this, politically or economically, will be going. And, and people will keep saying, oh, you can keep talking about the tax, like the VAT for schools and the tax breaks for non-DOMs and stuff like that. That's not going to pay for all of it. It's like, no, but there's plenty more to come. So that's a big one in terms of what you can do in terms of increasing tax revenues. It's not raising the rate of tax for people already paying their taxes. It's getting people who don't pay their taxes to bloody well pay them. There's a lot of scope in that. But also, you just need to take the view that if you think about why Rishi Sunak is wanted to become Chancellor first of all, then Prime Minister, it's because a little tweak here, a little tweak there makes him a lot of money. Well, you can do the same thing for a country. So there is the scope there, but they have to do it. If they want to win over, not just people in Scotland, people all over the UK, if they want to win them over and tell them, look what happened in 2019. Boris Johnson said to a load of places that don't normally vote Conservative, thank you, we recognise we've only lent your vote. We are going to deliver so that you can see it was a vote well spent. Well, Labour need to do the same. The Conservatives didn't deliver, so now they're going to lose those votes. Labour, if they don't deliver, they will lose those votes as well. What can Labour do to push for PR? Stop listening to boneheads who come up with crap about it. There's huge support within Labour Front. I don't just mean the membership. I'm not going to say we shouldn't listen to the membership. I often say we shouldn't listen to the membership on a lot of policies because, generally speaking, the membership is out of kilter with Labour voters. Labour members are not at all like Labour voters. And there's a few 100,000 Labour members, and we need millions of Labour voters, like millions. So I'm not going to say we should listen to the members just because they agree with me on this one. But, you know, the public as well are in favour of it, by and large. Yes, it's not been tested because it's not been made a policy. We need to see how the public will react if the media go apeshit on it. Maybe what needs to come first is some media regulation. I don't know. But, you know, there is support for it, though. I do wonder how much of the media would really attack it that much. Given that Reform UK want PR, I wonder whose side they'd fall on in the end. But ultimately, what needs to happen is there will be a campaign. There is a campaign in Labour, and it's sort of worked pretty well over the last few years. You know, the official Labour policy, for those who don't know, is that first past the post is a terrible system. So that is now a Labour's official position. Labour's official position is we should have a different system of elections. Unfortunately, Labour's position is also that there is no obvious one to replace it with. It's a little bit like the quandary the Tories have at the moment. The far right of the party. They want Rishi Sunak gone. They see him as a bad leader for different reasons that I do. They see him as a bad leader, so they want him gone. Their quandary is they don't know who to back to get rid of him. So Labour's official policy is the same thing. First past the post is really bad. They've formally said this year that it is effectively toxic. They've said it damages trust in politics. The nature of first past the post damages trust in politics. That is Labour's official position. But they also say there's no consensus for what should replace it. I don't agree with that. But that is their official position. So we need a campaign that basically, this is why I want, as well as the campaign within Labour, I want an external campaign to get themselves on the telly, to get themselves noticed by the public, to really get people talking about PR. Then we can really, then the media will react, then the Tories will react, then we can gauge public opinion. I see that the India trade deal is quietly ramping up Sunak's swan song. Yeah, he's back again, isn't he? He's back on trying to get that. He wants that. That'll make him a mint. Or his wife, more specifically, but you know, the same household. So that is the thing. Although I did see an interesting comment piece. I can't remember where. It may have been the Financial Times or the Guardian. They're usually the places where I read this sort of international news. But I saw some article somewhere which was basically saying if Sunak can get an agreement before the election, that'll work out really well for Sunak and Modi. And I'm thinking, well, it could work out for Sunak maybe because in terms of politically, because then it's like a big trade deal and they will, of course, oversell the benefits. Have people noticed, by the way, that the OBR have revised down the benefits from joining the CPTPP? They were already basically zero, but now they're even more zero. But I don't see how it's going to. Is it? I mean, is it going to benefit Modi electorally if Labour come straight into power and say we don't like this deal? Because unless it's signed, sealed, and delivered, and it's really difficult to see how he can do that in the time he's got left. Unless it is signed, sealed, and delivered before the election, Labour can just look at it and go, no. Because the India trade deal that Sunak will get, and I'm quite happy to wait until he's got it before I judge it, but realistically, what we know is that India doesn't really want a trade deal with us. It's not that it actively doesn't want it. It's not that bothered. Like Indian businessmen, for example, they're not that arsed. It doesn't do them any good, really. Apart from the visas, that's what they desperately want. And that's what will get Sunak in trouble with his party. So it's really hard to see how he gets it. But if he gets an agreement in principle, Labour can just come straight in and go, we don't like this. Because it contravenes their stated policy in terms of alignment with the EU. And also, isn't it a bit of a stick to beat Sunak with if Labour go, well, here they are banging on about immigration, and this deal is going to massively increase immigration. And the Conservatives are denying it. They're saying, no, it won't. It's like, if you're making it easier to get visas, you'll have more visas. It's that simple. And the reason why India wants more visas is because they want more Indian workers from companies like Infosys to be able to go and work in the British centres of those Indian companies. That's what they want. They want more Indian workers working in their own companies in their outreach centres in Britain. But anyway, right, I'm missing lots of comments here. I keep going off on one. One saying, given that we are either about to or are going through a cultural societal paradigm shift, do I think that might help Labour on the progressive policies front? I have a feeling it will. It could do, because there should be such an immediate noticeable difference between the way, because apart from anything else, Labour should come across as way more competent to begin with, and there won't hopefully be lots of backbiting in the party. Could they leave it a few years, a decade or so? So potentially, yes. I mean, what needs to happen is the Overton window has been shifting further to the right and towards the sort of authoritarian views. Labour's job ultimately is to pull it back. The Overton window, for those who don't know, I mentioned it quite a bit. It's basically, imagine policies all over the political compass, not, the political spectrum, authoritarian, left, right, socially liberal, blah, blah, blah. You've got all these different possible policies, right? Some of them will appeal to the swing voters that can get you into power. Some of them are neutral, and some of them will actively lose you votes, important votes, I mean. I don't mean votes in your strongholds or the seats where you've got no chance of winning anyway. So some votes will win you, give you a net win of votes in target seats, and some will lose you them. And the policies that are vote positive are what are described as the Overton window. And it moves. The public's perception of different policies changes. So it has moved towards authoritarianism and to the right. So Labour need to move it back. And the way they will move it back is by, a three-step process. First of all, doing something completely different to the Conservatives. Second, making sure it works. And third, pointing out very loudly how it has worked. And the reason it worked is because they did the opposite of the Tories. Labour need to spend as much time saying, weren't the Tories shit? Look how easy it is when you've got sensible policies, as they do bigging themselves up. Daniel saying, the worst possible outcome of Sunak losing the vote on the Rwanda bill would likely result in the PM losing his job, resulting in the bedding of a fourth Prime Minister and another year of the Tories. Well, this is the thing. Right, so if he loses the vote next week, the Tories are completely, the government is stuck, because this isn't like losing the infected blood vote last week or earlier this week, however you want to look at it. That was something that he lost a vote. It's not good, but governments lose votes. This next week, it would be losing a vote on arguably their central policy platform. It's ridiculous that it's their central policy platform, but it is. That's how they've basically painted themselves into a corner. If he loses that vote, then basically Rishi Sunak either has to come up with a different bill. But the problem with it will be, unless it's a materially different bill, it won't be allowed. You're not allowed, if you lose a vote in Parliament, you're not allowed to present a substantially similar motion to Parliament again that session. And there are no more sessions before the election. So Sunak would have to do something radically different that would satisfy the Speaker that it's a fundamentally different bill. And if he can't do that, and he probably can't, but I don't know. If he can't do that, then at that point, the Tories are facing the situation that they cannot proceed with their main policy aim. And then it's either time to say, right, we're going to make this a manifesto promise and go to the polls, in which case, why hang about? You go to the polls early. Or you replace the leader. And there are some people who think the election's more likely, and there are some people who think changing the leader is more likely. And I don't know, because I don't speak to any Tory MPs, much less all of them. And I would want to speak to all of them to know what their views would be. Like, I would really be interested, from Tory MPs' point of view, if they had to face a choice, if their government really did get stuck, properly stuck, what? Because Sunak absolutely cannot. Because what he might try and say is, okay, we're going to have to shelve this now. We'll make it a manifesto issue. So when the election comes around, we'll put it in the manifesto. We'll just have to leave it for now. I don't think that's going to wash. So, you know, I'd be interested in asking Tory MPs, which would you prefer? An election where the polls look like they do now, or changing the leader, which will be damaging, and you may end up with someone worse than Sunak. In fact, there's a very good chance they end up with someone worse than Sunak. I would be interested. What asylum routes will be open when the Ukraine and Hong Kong schemes finish? Good question. Really, very. I mean, if you think about Afghanistan, we supposedly have a scheme to allow people fleeing the Taliban to claim asylum in the UK, but practically it doesn't exist, because, and the evidence for that is so many Afghans are themselves crossing the channel in these boats. The huge number of the people crossing the channel in these boats are from Afghanistan. So, yeah, you could reasonably surmise that very few genuinely safe routes, if any, will exist. And the Ukrainian route was crap as well. I mean, that was really hard going for them. I don't know how straightforward the one was for people from Hong Kong. They say Starmer's demoted, deselected, sidelined, or expelled anyone who disagrees with them, such as Jamie Driscoll, Naomi Wimborne Idrissi, etc. They haven't been expelled at all. He's moved people. Because what do you want? Do you want him to have someone in his top tier? I mean, they're not even in Parliament. So I don't know what you're on about there. They've not been removed anywhere. The government own this speaker, don't they? Is near Burko. Well, you know, again, we don't want to... I mean, Burko was a product of his time. At the time, like, the speaker represents Parliament. That applies to Burko as much as it does Hoyle. They represent Parliament. Towards the end of John Burko's time as Speaker, Parliament was a hung Parliament. So the majority of MPs were not Conservative MPs. So he seemed more that he challenged the government more. It's not that he was challenging the government more. It's that Parliament was challenging the government more. He's the Speaker. He speaks for Parliament. Whereas Lindsay Hoyle, now Lindsay Hoyle is fundamentally a weaker character. I will grant you. I will give you that. He's a much weaker character. I don't think the comparison with a supply teacher is unfair. I mean, I've been a supply teacher. I've been that, like, powerless, and it fits. He's like that. That's what he's like. But at the same time, he is still also a product of his time. He has become a speaker with the Conservatives having a large majority. The majority of Parliament are Conservatives. So the fact that he does still go off on one when the government, like, he doesn't let them get away with it, but he has very limited powers. I will grant you he is weak, but he's not, like, I wouldn't describe him as corrupted at all. He's just reflecting the fact that the majority of Parliament are Conservatives. How do I believe our party will work to improve, this was the Labour Party, work to improve the transport infrastructure, and how soon would I expect results? Buses would be the easiest one right now, wouldn't it? I think actually one quick thing. I don't know about expectations, but in terms of one thing, I would urge Louise Haigh to do, who will be Labour's Transport Secretary, and she is very big on rail network. That's her hobby horse, if you like. One thing I would do is and I've said this before, I would do what they're planning to do with water companies. So with water companies, it's like sewage discharges, you will receive automatic fines. If you're not monitoring, you will receive automatic fines. There's none of this having to judge whether or not it fit within certain rules or exceptions. It's like, no, if you dump sewage, you will get fined. If you are going to say that there are some times when you sort of have to, well, you will take the fine, you will take the hit, okay? And they won't be allowed to just bung it on to the cost of people's bills either. It will come out of their profits. I would do something similar to the railways, right? I would do something similar to trains. I wouldn't, if they cancel a service. Now, I will give one proviso here, because today, for example, there's been a rail strike, ASLEF this time. But again, you could argue with the Labour government, things like that shouldn't really need to cut. There were very few strikes when Labour were in government. It's not because they're in the pockets of the trade unions. The economy worked. It's because they basically wanted agreements. But I would say, with the exception of industrial action, if a service is cancelled, automatic fine. So if they say, for example, because they do this, the last train I didn't catch because I couldn't because it was cancelled, leaving me stranded in Doncaster briefly. They say, oh, sorry, there's no staff. We'll hire more staff then. Stop. So the reason they did it is because they don't want to hire enough staff so that they can cancel the unprofitable late night services, right? But they are some of the more important because you're stuck. What if you're vulnerable? What if you're a vulnerable person stuck at night time surrounded by a load of drunks at a train station with no security, right? So you don't cancel services, you're going to get fined. And make sure the fine is set such that it costs them less to employ enough people to run those services than it does to pay the fine. Make the fine more expensive than just hiring enough staff. Because that way you'll generate more work as well. You get more people employed. So that is what I would do. That's me. That would be one of my first, in terms of immediate impact. And I don't know how immediate that can be. It's all right saying, oh, I would just do, even a minister isn't just a law unto themselves. I don't know how quickly they could implement something like that. It might be there's certain contractual obligations and it has to wait a bit, a few months or a year or whatever. I don't know. But that is in terms of something that could make an immediate difference. Because you can't obviously just massively expand the rail network overnight. That would be a very long-term project. But what you can do is say to the train companies, look, we're going to basically bring you into national hands when your contract's up anyway. But in the meantime, we're going to give you the water company treatment. You're going to provide the services. You're not going to keep jacking up prices. You're going to provide your services, and if you don't, we'll fine you. And your fines will come out your profits. And then we'll maybe see a few rail companies decided that maybe they'd like their contracts to end sooner rather than later, which Labour will not mind in the slightest. But anyway, would Penny Mordaunt or Kemi Badenoch be Tory leader in a fourth leadership contest? My view, I will put a caveat in here, but my general view is they will have to produce a ballot that goes to the members this time. I can understand Tory MPs will be desperate, absolutely desperate, if there's got to be a leadership contest for it to be as quick as possible. They want as quick a transition as possible. Because while the contest is going on, they will be losing votes by the bucketful. Or there's a risk that they will. So, but I think this time they can't do another stitch up like they did with Rishi Sunak. And there is zero prospect of the party. With Theresa May, basically MPs just agreed that there shouldn't be a contest. So they all decided to back Theresa May. They got Boris Johnson to withdraw. Michael Gove, stabbing him in the back on that one. Or in the front, actually. He didn't actually bother to do it behind his back. But that's not going to happen this time. The party's too divided. They're not going to get... There is no compromise candidate. Rishi Sunak was the compromise candidate. He's gone. Or he will be gone. He's still there. Actually, let's just check. Yes, he's still there. So... Yeah, so what they will do, when those two names go to the members, they will pick the craziest one. My caveat is, it is possible that Suella Braverman is too crazy for them. But I wouldn't put it past them. Now, the main saving grace here, the main hope, is that Suella Braverman has pissed off too many on the right of the party and that they would not swing behind her. So there is every possibility that Suella Braverman will not have enough support to find herself on that final ballot. But they will pick the craziest one. I think if the members are given a choice of... I think it's unlikely that the final two will end up being Badenoch and Mordaunt. But it is possible. And if that happens, you would say probably Badenoch. At the moment, you would say Badenoch. Obviously, we don't know what happens in the next 2 months. But yeah, that's what I would suggest. But they will pick the craziest option. But there we go. People are talking about sweets now. What's going on? High streets need to change their business model, not be open when everyone's at work. Watched a documentary a few years ago about steps that had to be taken. Can only do so much. So I'm not a particular expert on this, but I'll tell you another thing that will definitely be part of the solution, because I don't pretend to know what the solution to high streets is, and I don't watch telly, so I won't come across documentaries or anything like that unless the Financial Times run a piece on it. I'm not going to know. But there is one of the problems is you've got so many properties that are closed down, because if you're someone who owns these properties, so you own high street shops. I don't mean like the buildings. I mean, you own the buildings and you rent them out to the shops. They charge rents that are far too high in terms of the amount of business that exists on the high street now. So what you really need to do, at the very least, is... The problem is at the moment, let's say you own 4 properties and you can fill 2 of them with high rents. You'll do that and leave the other 2. It's more money for you to have those open and have 2 properties empty at your whack high rents than it is to lower your rents and have them all occupied. Now that's in terms of the owner. They are just pursuing the most profitable business model. That's down to them. I don't criticise that. But this is where the government should step in, because there is a suggestion that actually what should happen is if you've got a high street property, it doesn't have to be literally on the high street, but a town centre property in what might be deemed the high street, that there's a responsibility for you to have it occupied. And what you could do is a Dutch auction. So you effectively auction the rent. And that means, so the emphasis has to be, the priority has to be on having them all occupied, having all these properties occupied. Because the thing is as well, first of all, it just looks bad when you've got shops empty. But second of all, so you let someone use that space. They're selling there with their business. So people come and use that business. Well, that is then footfall for other businesses around it anyway. So, you want them all occupied. And that would be something you could do that's something a government could do quite easily. You could change the emphasis. And Labour I have not heard them say this, by the way, but it's the sort of thing that fits, because there's... Labour's emphasis is much more in line with my thinking. My feeling is I understand executives and I understand business owners are prioritising profit. That I understand that. I don't criticise that. But it is down to a government to make sure that a business justifies itself, not in terms of its profit, but in terms of its value to society and to the community in which it exists. So that's where the balance is supposed to be. The executives and the business owners are chasing the profits. Fine, as long as it's legal. The government are the ones who legislate to make sure that they're having to be beneficial to society. But there we go. Wendy's saying, do I think they'll go for the double whammy of female and ethnicity? Surely they're too misogynistic and xenophobic to try that again. I really don't think they are. Like, people said this about the prospect of Rishi Sunak becoming leader, and lots of people said, oh, the Tories are too racist, or they'll allow themselves to believe that voters are too racist to vote for Rishi Sunak. And I thought to myself, I know we associate Tories with being racist. I actually think the vast majority are really just xenophobic more than racist. I really do. And so I didn't really see a big problem. And I don't think there's been any polling evidence to suggest it has been a problem. I've not seen any polling evidence to suggest that the colour of Sunak's skin or his name has been a barrier at all. It's the fact that he's just crap at politics. That's his barrier. And the fact he inherited a deeply divided party. So he's like Boris Johnson. He's the sort of leader that could only have made a success by taking over during some sort of golden age. Really. But no, I don't think Tories have a real problem with that. I think they're more xenophobic than racist. And I think even racist voters or party members will still prefer to vote for the Conservatives because here's the difference. Like, you look at Labour and you go, well, they haven't even had a female leader. They had an interim leader, that was about it. And my argument to that is, yes, but look at the legislation they put in. They are the party that have improved the rights of every woman in the country. The Conservatives have given the top job to 3 women. Labour have empowered over 30 million in the country. Well, it wasn't 30 million at the time Labour were in power, but half the population with their legislation. So I think Tory voters, even racist voters, can be a bit pragmatic. They can think to themselves, well, we might have someone whose skin colour I don't approve of in the top job, but I do approve of their policies. They'd rather have someone like that elevated and everyone else in the country under their heel, is the way I would look at it. But I have absolutely no evidence, I've seen no evidence that the colour of someone's skin is a barrier in the Tory party to becoming leader, despite what we might sort of extrapolate from their very obvious, I would say mostly xenophobia. There are racists. But to be honest, again, haven't Reform UK basically attracted most of the actual racists? Could Labour bring us closer to a form of Keynesian economics? I do hope so. They almost might need to, because Keynesian economics really fires up during tough times, doesn't it? And we are going to have very tough times for a very long time. We're not talking about like the global recovery being on the horizon at all. And even if it were, we're still stuck with Brexit after it. So we can't just hit the ground running like every other economy will be able to. And we're behind even on things that other major economies are working on. Like, I've noticed, I haven't done the video on this yet, I've noticed it looks like we are going to get this deal on rules of origin for electric cars. It sounds to me like it's a proposal at the moment, but the EU have made the proposal, not us. It's a 3-year deal, right? So it'll stave off rules of origin issues for 3 years. After that, the EU intend to make sure they're in a position not to need it. Are we going to be in that position? I suspect not. So I suspect in 3 years' time, when Labour are in power, so they'll get the flak for this, in 3 years' time, we're going to be in a lot of trouble because I'm not sure that in 2 years, because that's probably all they'll have, they are going to be able to boost our electric cell production enough. But we will see. At which point, I mean, the way I look at it is this: the more desperate you are, the more likely, the more radical you may be forced to be, because Labour are obviously laser focused on winning the election. When they win power, they will still be laser focused on winning the next election. I have little doubt about that. It's a very different way of doing it, and that's why we have to wait to see if Labour will be good at it. But they have, you know, if it looks like if it looks like they start losing in the polls, and the polls won't stay like this when they're in power, of course, but if it looks like the Conservatives are gaining serious ground on them, and it's because they're not turning the economy around quickly enough, then they won't be able to just snap their fingers and turn the economy around quickly. But what they can do, what they do have the power to do, is to raise people's standard of living with a redistribution of wealth. Now, I don't imagine that they're going to completely change our economic model. Apart from anything else, we know what will happen. We will end up with a run on the pound. So we can't speak the horses. But if Labour are forced into, we know what happens when politicians get desperate. We've seen it with the Tory party. Well, Labour will be desperate to win the next election as well, I hope. But anyway, we'll sort of have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for coming on, everyone. Have a very good evening, and until next time, I'll see you later.